We are live. We are live here. This is Black Tower Radio. I'm your host, Jake Fox. We're broadcasting on 1040 AM, 92.1 FM, WYSL in Rochester, New York. Also on World News Radio Today. That's World News Radio Today. And we are joined here by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, he's the co-creator of Reaganomics, former editor of the Wall Street Journal, former professor at Georgetown University, amongst many other universities. You can go on and on with his resume. It's lengthy and very impressive, and anyone who listens to this show is very well acquainted with Dr. Roberts and his beliefs. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Roberts.
Thanks, Jake. Glad to be with you.
All right, so I wanted to get started in a geopolitical discussion. We got this situation where what's happening here is the United States is pushing for a new Cold War with Russia, and Medvedev has acknowledged such, saying we are in a new Cold War. Turkey is looking to invade northern Syria. Saudi Arabia is threatening ground troops into Syria. We're about to put American troops directly on the Russian border for the first time fairly soon. Where is all this going? And do you think Putin is clever enough to stop all of this from happening?
First, let's talk about why it's happening. Then it's easier to understand the rest of it. It's happening, Jake, for two reasons. One is the military security complex, which President Eisenhower warned us about, I think it was 50-something years ago in 1961 in his farewell address to the public. He warned us that the military security complex was a direct threat to our democracy and had undue influence, and that was after only 15 years of it. He explained that the reason we had this military security complex was because normally when a war ends, you demilitarize, but because of the Soviet threat, we hadn't. And it had left in place this armaments industry, and it had grown more and more solidified and more powerful and more influential. And so that was 55 years ago, I think. 1961, about 55 years ago. So we've now had 55, 60, 70 years of it. And it's extremely powerful, and it doesn't make money except off of the government budget. And so it needs an enemy. And when the Cold War ended with Reagan and Gorbachev, really, and then the Soviets collapsed, it didn't have an enemy. And so we created the Muslim threat, the war on terror, to give it an enemy. And the trouble with this threat, Jake, is it's not big enough to be a threat to a superpower. And the 15 years of being bogged down in wars with a handful of lightly armed so-called terrorists and not being able to defeat them, this was shaking our image. And so we decided that, Russia, let's get back to Russia because they're scary, it's big, they got atomic weapons and all that, nuclear weapons. Well, the other driving force for this is the Neoconservatives, because they have this ideology of American world hegemony, that we are chosen by history to impose our system on the rest of the world. And so when the Russians under Putin showed that they were strong enough to oppose us, first in Syria and then in Iran. You may remember we were all set to invade Syria based on the bogus charge that Assad had used chemical weapons. And the Russians stopped it with diplomacy, showed that was a fraud, and solved the solution by getting all the chemical weapons out of Syria. And then we were determined to attack Iran based on the fake charge of nuclear weapons, and the Russians defused that and stopped us again. So that got the neoconservatives' attention that we were faced with a country strong enough to block our exercise of hegemony. And the neocon policy, which is the basis of our foreign policy, is that a principal goal of American foreign policy is to prevent the rise of any other country that can serve as a check on our unlimited use of power. So that then shifted the attention to Russia. And then we had the Ukraine, the coup we arranged in Ukraine. And what we were doing in Syria, when they blocked our invasion, we sent over there the guys we had used against Gaddafi in Libya and told them to overthrow Assad, and then we pretended like this was Syrian rebels opposing a dictator. These were democratic rebels, and so on and so on. Well, the Russians and the Iranians looking at this could see a direct threat to their own stability, because if Assad was overthrown, he's a secular leader. He's not Syria is not an Islamic state. And you get these jihadists in there, then all of that kind of trouble would be exported into the Muslim parts of the Russian Federation, would be exported into Iran. Iran consists of Persians, but a lot of other ethnic groups. And these two countries would be then destabilized. So the Russians said, we're not having it. And they went into Syria and began mopping up the Islamists that we had sent there. Well, so what could we do about it? Well, not a whole lot. Apparently, a majority of the American military does not want ground involvement there. But the neocons do. And so they have used their connections to Turkey to get the Turks all riled up. You have to remember now that the notorious neocon Richard Pearl was for many, many years, and may still be, Turkey's representative in Washington. And of course, they also then enlisted the Saudis, who have a stake in suppressing the Shia part of the Muslim population. And so what they're trying to do, in my opinion, is to bluff the Russians into the prospect that two large armies are going to invade, and then the Russians would have to get involved on the ground. And they're trying to bluff them with the hope that it will make the Russians more agreeable to a negotiated settlement that's less favorable to Syria, to Russia, and to Iran. They would like to get some kind of a fake democratic government. When I say they, I mean Washington, in Damascus, that could then be taken over by the jihadists. So for the Russia, it's a critical issue that their own stability is at stake. So they can't walk away from this. So what is going to happen? Well, the Saudis keep saying they will not go in unless American troops lead it. And there's been speculation about sending one of our airborne brigades to lead this, but there doesn't seem to be any enthusiasm on part of the military to do that. Now, the Turks' problem has to do more with the Kurds, because they're a large groups of Kurds in Turkey itself and the Kurds in Syria, and the Turks and the Kurds in Turkey would like to create their own country. So it would sort of take away parts of Turkey. So they want to invade to put down the Kurds. Now, that might be all they want to do, or that might be cover for an invasion that they can broaden into an attack on Assad. But of course, that would bring them into conflict with Russia, and Turkey is no match for Russia, but they may be hoping that Russia wouldn't engage them because Turkey is a member of NATO, and then that would present Russia with possibly having to deal with NATO and the U.S., though I doubt that the European countries would come to Turkey's rescue. I mean, assuming they even had the means to do that, which they don't. So it looks to me like a lot of bluff, but bluff can always miscalculate and get out of hand. So you could end up there with a very dicey situation in which the Russians have to use very decisive action in order to prevent losing the situation. So I would say it's a risky situation. It's a product of recklessness and irresponsibility on the part of Washington. I mean, Washington should be very, very clear to the Turks and to the Saudis to forget all about it, because the little bit of interest they have is nothing compared to the prospect of a general war that could end up with nuclear weapons. So I think that the administration in Washington and NATO are behaving in the most irresponsible and reckless way and are endangering life on Earth. So, but apparently Obama can't completely override these neoconservatives. They're just too entrenched in Washington, and they can operate independently of Obama. So it is a serious and dicey situation.
Well, this just happened within the last hour. A car bomb hit a Turkish military bus at a red light in Ankara. 28 dead, 61 wounded. The PKK is being blamed by the government, which is, for everyone listening at home, are the Kurds. And there's a media blackout in Turkey for everything related to this event. And Erdogan vows retaliation after the Ankara attack, according to the AFP. So, that just happened. It seems like I mean, I don't know if that, I mean, with everything going on in the world lately, I don't know if that's self-inflicted, so they can have a reason to do something, or if that was real. I mean, I don't think the Kurds doing something like that, that'd be it'd be a very dumb move for them to do something like that. But I don't know. I'd like to get your take on that.
I don't see what the Kurds have to gain from it. They're being shelled. I mean, they're a combat force, and they're being shelled already by the Turks, and that type of action doesn't affect the outcome of the military conflict that they're in. So for them to go to all the trouble and resources and stuff to pull something like that, it could just be some group of Kurds inside Turkey that's not thinking, or it could be a false flag event arranged by the Turkish government itself for the reasons you say, that they now can say, oh, look what's happened for us. But of course, they're already in conflict with Kurds. I mean, they've been bombing or artillery barrage, I think, has been going on for, 4 or 5 days, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't see why they need an event like that in order to continue a military conflict with the Kurds that they've already undertaken. Now, it may be they want to expand the conflict such that they actually send troops into Syria. But whether that would go beyond a few miles where the Kurds are or become something bigger would be the issue. And I think that if the Kurds made some kind of incursion that involved the Russians, and they didn't clear that first with NATO and Washington, they'd be left hanging. That's just the way I feel about it. I just don't think Europe wants to put itself at risk for this crazy guy that's running Turkey, or for his ability to decimate the Kurds. Now, if it's the neoconservatives behind all this, then they're hoping that it would provoke some kind of conflict with Russia. And then they would use that to say, well, look, Turkey's a NATO ally. We have to go to his aid. So that could also be an element in there. In fact, the neoconservatives will try to use it, whether it's false flag or real. And so they'll be making their kinds of arguments in Washington in support of whatever it is Turkey wants to do. In fact, they may be handing Turkey the script.
How much control do you think Obama has over this situation? I mean, all of the elements that are working against him or for him, internally and externally. I mean, there's so many moving parts to this. But there's so much black ops. There's things like this happening all the time. And it also doesn't seem like he's too eager to jump in with both feet for a catastrophic war with how he dealt with the Iran situation.
Well, he doesn't have complete control, I think, except for his extremely hostile and propagandistic lies that he tells about Russia. I don't know why he continues to do that, but except for that, he seems much less inclined to support more violence than he did for 7 years of his regime. So I think and it may be the military itself are dragging their feet. It may also be that the neoconservatives have suffered such massive failures of their policies that the old foreign policy establishment is somewhat back on its feet, somewhat back in the argument, and starting to bring criticisms, and that these are voiced within the administration, and then Obama is hearing them, so that the kind of complete control the neoconservatives had during George W. Bush's regime and the first part of Obama's, that may be fading. So other voices may be more important now. The military has learned a lot of hard lessons about trying to deal with these kinds of conflict situations. I mean, after 15 years in Afghanistan, the U.S. couldn't defeat a few thousand lightly armed Taliban. After 8 years of Iraq, look at the situation now. I mean, it's unbelievable. The Islamic State controls a large part of the country. I mean, it's such a huge defeat for the neocons and everything they said. Maybe you remember, Jake, they promised us a 6-week cakewalk that wouldn't cost the American taxpayers 1 cent. That's what they promised. And it's just been too much failure. I mean, this is the biggest failure of foreign and military policy in world history. It's been going on for 15 years. A total failure. Everything's out of control. It's worse out of control than we could have ever imagined. And not only that, the Russians had to step in to stop it getting worse. Now, the trouble with the Obama administration, it keeps pretending in times that ISIS is not really ISIS, but they're a bunch of Democrats fighting a dictator. And then at other times, it pretends it's going there to fight ISIS. And that, when they say that, it looks like cover. What they're trying to do is to solidify ISIS control of some of the cities in eastern Syria, which in eastern Syria is where most of the oil is, in order to be able to keep leverage over Assad. So I think what the question that's before everybody right now is, will some combination of Turkish and Saudi troops enter into eastern Syria in order to prevent the Syrian army and Russian air power from driving the Islamic State completely out of Syria? Or will the Syrian army get to these strategic cities first, or if it looks like the Turks and the Saudis are, will the Russians drop paratroopers? So I think that's the sort of thing that everybody is waiting to see what happens. And I do not believe the Saudis will do anything without American involvement. The Turks are different. How much they will do remains to be seen. I think it'll mainly be bluster, because I think the Turkish guy is not getting any kind of encouragement from Europe or from Obama. You know, the Americans support the Kurds, so we're not really happy about the Turks beating up on the Kurds. On the other hand, the neocons don't care about anybody, and if the Turks beating up on the Kurds is a way of getting Turkish troops inside of Syria and maybe into some conflict with Russia, which could further, be heightened and increased and worsened, they would favor that. So these different sorts of agendas will play out. I think the Russians will do everything they can to avoid spreading the war. Their only interest is to get rid of the Islamic State, because they can't stand a jihad there in Syria, and neither can Iran. So hopefully it'll just end up a lot of bluster on the part of the Saudis and the Turks, and the neocons won't be able to pull off what they hope.
So let's say that Turkey is going to be given the green light to invade northern Syria because of this incident. What would the ramifications of that be for Turkey and Russia?
Well, that part of Syria right now is not where the Russians and the Syrian army are operating. They're driving into the east to clear out ISIS. So if the Turks are just after, like a 10-mile strip where they're Kurds, Syria and Russia may overlook it, and rather than be distracted by it, just go on and finish off the Islamic State. I don't think the United States can give Turkey the green light to do that because we support the Kurds. And, there's a limit to how many betrayals you can do and still have anybody cooperate with you. We've betrayed so many people already. So I'm just not. I think if there was any prospect of us giving Turkey a go-ahead to do that, they wouldn't have to use this car bomb of a military bus. That would be, even if it happened, it wouldn't be important to the decision. So I see that, the way the Turks are playing that, is an effort by the government to find some excuse that they can use to get us to accept them going in. But I don't think it'll work. It's just not a big enough thing. It's not a big enough false flag. So even if it is a false flag. So I think and time for this intervention, should it actually be on the books, for that intervention to work, it needs to have already happened, because the Syrian army now is already, I think, approaching one of the key cities that the Saudi and Turkish invasion would be focused on. And if the Syrians are there first, then it's very difficult, as they're backed by the Russians, for the Saudis and the Turks to go there to attack them. But if they got there first, the Saudis and the Turks, that would be different. Because then the question would be, does Syria and Russia want to attack the Saudis and the Turks? So I think the fact that the invasion hasn't happened when time is of the essence, and the Syrians are just about there, it's not likely to happen. I mean, it could, because there's always miscalculations, and when this type of confusion gets underway, things are unpredictable. Things can happen that no one intended. So it's kind of like mobilization. Once it starts, it's hard to stop it. So this sort of thing could get out of hand, but I think that the invasion from Syria and Turkey, I think this has waited too long to be effective at this point. Plus, there are reports that the Russians have put their entire southern command on high alert and have various paratrooper divisions ready to be airdropped into those cities, and they can do that long before the Turks and the Saudis could get there. And that's the last thing that Turks and Saudis are going to do, is confront Russian divisions. So I kind of feel that the neocons have been defeated. And I kind of think that the U.S. military was part of that, because, they've had to put up with these people now for a long time. And although a good part of the higher brass in the American military are bloodthirsty and criminally inclined, in general, the officer corps still has integrity. And so they're not going to do something stupid that they know isn't going to work and that they don't really see the point of in the first place. If you look at the way the conflict in the Middle East has changed since it began, it no longer has anything to do with the original idea that we had to get bin Laden because he blew up the World Trade Center. None of this had anything to do with that matter, Iraq. And so the whole thing has changed so much that the military has to see that, you know, what we were supposed to be doing is no longer even relevant to what's happening now. So why is it happening? What is the agenda? Who can say what the agenda is?
No one knows.
Nobody knows. In fact, Obama admitted when he came into office he didn't know what the agenda was in Afghanistan. Well, you know, a lot of commentators say, oh, the agenda is to steal their oil. Well, that's probably part of the agenda. But the real agenda is the neoconservatives trying to exercise hegemony, trying to clear out secular governments that are not American puppet states, trying to get rid of cohesion of countries that can stand up to Israel, because the neoconservatives are totally allied with Israel. Syria and Iran are suppliers of Hezbollah, and Lebanon. Hezbollah is the militia that twice defeated the Israeli army when Israel tried to annex southern Lebanon for its water resources. Hezbollah ran the Israeli army out of the country twice. So Israel would like to see the end of Iran and Syria, because then there's nobody to finance and supply arms to Hezbollah, and Israel can steal Lebanon, or the southern part of it, which is what they want at this time. So those kinds of motives are all there playing. The neoconservatives are in cahoots with Israel. Many of them, I think, are dual American-Israeli citizens. So with that kind of a mess, it's unpredictable. But I think the military, our military, has seen enough of this that they want to know, you know, we got all this going on for what reason? This is demoralizing. We get troops killed. We don't know why we're doing any of this. And we don't really have a plan. So why go lead the Saudis into something that may involve us with Russia? In Syria, of all places. You know, it doesn't make any sense to a military person. So, and they can see that the Russians have a point, that they can't put up with a jihadist state there that can export destabilization into the Muslim parts of Russia, or into the former Soviet provinces that are Muslim, the countries now cooperating with Russia, like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. These were all part of the Soviet Union. They're Muslim. And so I don't think the military sees the point of that type of a conflict. You get some of these retired generals on Fox News who seem, it makes you wonder how they ever got to be generals. But you don't see many of our guys currently in uniform. You do have some of them, they'll say, oh, the Russians are an existential threat to the United States. But of course, what they mean is they are a threat to our ability to exercise our will wherever we want. That the Russians have their own foreign policy, and they're strong enough to have one. And so when the neoconservatives call a country a threat to America, they mean that that country has an independent foreign policy. That's what they mean. Now, of course, no European country or Britain or Canada or Australia or Japan have independent foreign policies. They all are vassals. what Russia and China do, and Iran, in India. And doesn't seem to be much we can do about that. And I think the military understands that, or enough of it does, that there's no unanimity about creating a third world war out of some scrape in Syria, where we have no interest whatsoever. we shouldn't be involved there at all. In fact, we should be shoring up Assad, because it is a secular, non-jihadist government. It's death on terrorists, just like Saddam Hussein was, just like Gaddafi was. So what we've done, we've gone in everywhere there was stability and secular governments that would not put up with Al-Qaeda or any of this stuff. We go in and try to wreck those governments. So this is what Putin keeps bringing to our attention year after year. What are you doing this for? If you're against terrorism, why do you go in and create them? Why do you put them in charge? Why don't you leave the secular guys there who are got their boot on all of this, who are suppressing it? What are you doing? You're freeing up all the trouble that you say you oppose. Well, that's exactly what we've done. So, eventually this dawns on American officers. They say, what the hell did we do this for?
Look at Iraq. It went from what you said to a center of jihadism. It's crazy.
Yeah, right. And Libya. And that's what they're trying to do in Turkey. So the contradiction between what we claim is a war on terror and what it really does is it empowers the terrorists by overthrowing the leaders that suppress them. That's all the United States has done. There weren't any terrorists until we started this. They couldn't be. The governments wouldn't permit it. There were no terrorists in Iraq. There weren't any in Syria. There weren't any in Libya. Now they're all over the place. They've even formed a state out of parts of Iraq and parts of Syria. So this is what I mean by the complete total failure of the neoconservative policies, and I think the U.S. military is aware of that, and I think they regard those neoconservatives as a bunch of idiots. And
wisely so.
They don't like to say that because they don't know when the next one's going to be the Undersecretary of Defense, and they don't know, and the neoconservatives on Obama's National Security Council, they block their promotions. So they don't like to say it, but that's what they think.
So why don't we get into a little bit of economics here a little bit. Every market you look at around the world is in the red this year. Some are doing worse than others. Deutsche Bank looks like it's buying its own debt to survive right now. Singapore looks like it's on the verge of a massive banking crisis. United States, as far as the world economy goes, looks a lot better than most areas of the world right now. What's happening here? Why is everything going down like this? I mean, and it's going down in unison. Everyone's going down together right now.
Well, the only reason the United States looks better, it's actually far worse than any other country, is the propaganda that you get about, we have recovered, we have this, we have that. What's happened, generally speaking, in the West is that the manufacturing that was the basis of blue-collar middle class was all sent offshore. And then the professional service jobs that university graduates take, such as software engineering, all they were sent offshore. So there's no middle-class employment. The middle class is shrinking. There's been no growth in real median family incomes in the United States in many years. In fact, it's declining. And what gains that have resulted have gone to shareholders and executives who get the benefit of the higher profits from the lower labor cost of sending the jobs offshore. So you have this incredibly skewed distribution of income and wealth. In the United States now, the distribution of income and wealth is worse than it is in many third world gangster states. So you have a population that's not benefiting at all from the economy. In fact, it's falling further behind. You have the beginning of social and political instability. And this is generally the case throughout the West. In Europe, the private banks, basically the German and Dutch private banks, are looting the Latin countries, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and forcing down the living standards of those peoples. So this is a really dangerous situation. Now, Russia is having a hard time, not from the sanctions, but from the collapse in oil prices. I mean, if the oil price goes down from over $100 to $20-something, I mean, that's a huge hit. China is having some trouble from the real estate over-speculation. But China still has the largest manufacturing industrial economy in the world. It still has, by far, the largest foreign exchange reserves. I mean, what we have is not a drop in the bucket. So I think that it's the West that's in the worst situation. And also South American countries that we have indebted and are now looting. You know, these various vulture funds are looting Argentina at the current time. They're always looting somebody. What you do, you go down there and you get them in debt, and they can't pay the debts, and so we send the IMF, and the IMF says, well, look, we'll pay your debts for you so you don't lose your credit rating, but then you got to pay us back. And how do you pay us back? Well, you cut your social pensions, you cut all social services, and use the tax money to give us, and then you have to sell off all your national assets. You got to turn the oil over to the American oil companies. You got to turn your banking system over to us. You got to sell your agricultural lands to American agribusiness. You have to accept American military bases. You have to vote with us in the UN. This is what we do to them. And that's why they're in trouble. So the picture, generally speaking, economically is very poor, particularly for the West and the third world countries that we have so ruthlessly exploited. And there's no economic strength there to support any kinds of war. So what we're seeing, look what we're seeing happening here. You see Democrats and Republicans cooperating in trying to push up the retirement age, even as the mortality rates of the white working class are falling. So they won't be happy until they get everybody dying before they can collect Social Security. I mean, Look at that. I mean, that's not a government that's representing anybody's interest except the military security complex, Wall Street, the Israel lobby, the extractive industries, and agribusiness. So it's these 5 powerful lobby groups that are ruling the country, and because of American dominance, ruling much of the world. And that's what China and Russia are tired of, and are not going to put up with any longer. So what's going to happen? It doesn't look like it's possible for the United States to come to any senses. The political process can't change anything. If you look at the quality of the leaders that we turn up, they get poorer and poorer and poorer, worse and worse. So I think collapse is what's in store. The United States is facing collapse. I think the EU is facing collapse. It doesn't serve all the countries that are members. Being vassals of the United States, they're being brought into conflicts with Russia that they have no interest in and no chance of surviving. I mean, we get into war. Russia's the end of Europe. There won't be anything there. It's child's play for Russia to eliminate Europe off the face of the earth. It wouldn't take them 30 seconds. So what do the Europeans got in this? They've got no stake in dying so that the Americans can be hegemonic over the earth. So I think the whole thing is, the West is collapsing. There's no leadership. There's no good decisions. Try to think of a good decision that's been made since Ronald Reagan ended stagflation and negotiated the end of the Cold War. Try to think of one good decision. I can't think of one.
Unfortunately, I can't either.
So that tells you, doesn't it, Jake? What else do you need to know? There's nothing here.
That's very sad. And on that note, I think we will...
Sad, but real. Anyhow, we've been on for a long time. Better tell you goodbye, hadn't I?
Yeah, Dr. Roberts. It was great having you on the show. I was just about to say we're about to go to break. Thank you very much for coming back on the show. Up next is our weekly segment, The Week with Wayne. We're going to be going with Wayne Madsen, running down his week's worth of articles. So stay tuned for The Week with Wayne. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Roberts, for coming on the show, bringing your wealth of knowledge, and hope to have you back on again in the future.
Sure, Jake, and thanks for sharing your audience, and all the best.
Thank you. You too. And that was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. We will be back with The Week with Wayne Madsen of WayneMadsenReport.com. So stay tuned, and we will be right back.